What's your favorite time travel story? In books, movies, comics? Time travel is a difficult thing to pull off, but when it's done well, it can be one of the greatest science fiction devices and make a story so memorable. And sometimes it creates a classic. I was thinking about time travel recently because I reread The Time Machine by O.G. Wells, the original. I say the original because H.G. Wells actually coined the term time machine as well as the term time traveler. And The Time Machine was his first book. It was his first novel, published in 1895, which is almost 130 years ago. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it has never gone out of print in that time. Of course, now it's in the public domain. You can find it anywhere. So today, I'm talking time travel blues. Let's go. Alright, my initial reaction to The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. It was a little underwhelming, I'm not gonna lie. I think that's just because time travel is seen so much now, and we've seen a lot of it done in a lot of different ways. Recently I watched that Netflix show Dark, the German show, and that was about time travel. That was an amazing version of time travel. Primer, Time Bandits, 12 Monkeys. There's so many examples, and we've seen so many different versions. So, when you read one of the very original time travel stories, it's, I wouldn't say it's a letdown, but it's very simple. But you have to remember, I mean, in 1895, this was a brand new thing, and H.G. Wells influenced so many writers. I think a lot of people took from him, and this story, like I said in the intro, it was his first book, and it became huge. Still now, people know about the Time Machine. They're still adapting it into movies, and people are still, cribbing these ideas. It's a short book. I have this little collection here from Barnes & Noble, which is, it's got the Time Machine and the Invisible Man, the Island of Dr. Moreau, and the War of the Worlds. The Time Machine begins on page 3 and ends on page 85. So that's how brief of a story it is. There is a deleted scene. There is a deleted section of the book. You can find that information on Wikipedia. It's kind of a spoiler, so I'm not going to talk about that in the 13th chapter. I don't believe my edition has that part. Some editions have it, some editions don't. So when you read The Time Machine, you may be reading the whole thing, or you may be reading a slightly abridged version. So look out for that. What am I talking about? The structure of the narrative is, a framed story. So it kind of reminded me of Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, or Wuthering Heights, in the sense that it's basically someone listening to, the narrator is listening to a character tell them the story without interruption. It's one long monologue, basically. So that's kind of a Victorian style. And speaking of the Victorian era, Wells was working at a time when the World Expos were being held in Paris and London and New York and Chicago and so on. And they had, the World's Fair or the World Expo. They had all these different cultures that no one had ever really interacted with before, never had thought of before, and different technologies and brand new cutting edge stuff that they were showing off and kind of blowing the minds of regular everyday people. With the hugeness of the world, and it really sparked the imaginations of a lot of writers and artists and inventors and engineers. And also at this time, there were a lot of tales being told. Writers such as Herman Melville and his sea stories, and all different kinds of adventure literature. And some of it involved like the South Pacific Islands. And I think there's some of that kind of filtered into the Time Machine. When the time traveler goes to the future, it seems like some of those adventure stories influenced the way that H.G. Wells wrote about the utopian society that the time traveler would come upon. Also in the Victorian era, there's the question of what does it mean to be civilized? What does it mean to be savage? What does it mean to have animal tendencies or the higher, human tendencies? And he would explore this theme much more in The Island of Dr. Moreau. But you can see already he's interested in this kind of thinking. If humans de-evolve, are they still human, or do we become something else entirely? And Wells makes it simple. He breaks it down. At the beginning of the story, there are 2 dinner parties, very Victorian, where he sort of sets up these archetypes of British culture. You have the red-haired Irishman named Philby. You have the business-minded, very young man. You have the kind of slow-witted provincial mayor. And you have a skeptical medical doctor, and then the narrator himself, who really is just there to listen to the story of the time traveler. The time traveler, he sets up time as a theory of the 4th dimension. He goes into a little bit of the science, even though everybody's so drunk that they don't really know or care what he's talking about. And the medical doctor kind of argues against him a little bit. And I guess this was a kind of a popular hypothesis in the 1880s. This guy, Charles Howard Hinton, published an essay called What is the Fourth Dimension? In 1880, and that was where he talked about time as the 4th dimension. And he also coined the term tesseract for all you Marvel nerds out there. So this idea was floating around at the time, but then later there's this guy H.S.M. Coxeter, oh god, who cited the theory of relativity and talked about how space-time is non-Euclidean, so it doesn't work, and he kind of completely debunked H.G. Wells. But H.G. Wells himself never called himself a science fiction writer. That was the more Jules Verne. Jules Verne tried to use real science to make stories that seemed like they could actually happen, whereas Wells called himself more of a romanticist. He was working in the romantic tradition, and so he didn't really pay attention to the science so much. It's more of a thought experiment. The science is not really supposed to be true science. It's just there to set up the comments on class and culture and evolution, de-evolution, utopia, dystopia, and these themes that he'll be playing with. This book has been cited as one of the earliest examples of the dying Earth subgenre of science fiction, which I am very interested in. And when everybody's drunk enough, the very young man can't even light his cigar, he's so drunk, it's time to bring out this little clock. And the little clock can travel through time, and the time traveler sets it up on a table, and he has one of the members of the group, click the button, and then it goes on its way. So they click the button, the little time machine disappears, supposedly it goes into the future. For some reason the candle blows out, and then the medical man thinks that this is a magic trick. He saw something similar done in Germany, and he says to everyone, wait until the common sense of the morning. Then cut to another dinner scene the following Thursday. A slightly different group of people. Philby and the very young man and the provincial mayor do not return. But the medical man and the psychologist and the narrator return, as well as a newspaper editor who's very hungry for, to collect gossip and any kind of random news that he can get. And there's also a silent man with a beard who some people have speculated might be H.G. Wells himself. When this group of people arrive at the time traveler's house for dinner, he's gone, but he's left a note saying, just ring the bell and the servants will start serving you. And they begin the dinner, and all of a sudden, crashing through the door comes the time traveler, and he's all bedraggled and kind of filthy, and he's got grass stains on his pants and his clothes, and he immediately demands wine, and he starts drinking wine, and then he goes upstairs and gets changed. He comes back down and drinks more and starts tearing into the mutton, and he promises that he will tell the story of what happened to him only if no one interrupts, and then that becomes the rest of the book, where it's just one long monologue of him telling of his time travel adventures. The guests are huddled around this dinner table, and it's all dark. There's a single lamp that's illuminating the time traveler, kind of seems like a spooky ghost story or something like that. This duality will come back throughout the book. The past and the future, the light and the darkness, the utopia and dystopia, peace and violence, love and violence. So the time traveler explains that earlier that same day, he was sitting in his workshop. He climbed onto the saddle of the time machine with his little levers that he controls where he can go. And this is an interesting description. He says that he felt like a suicide with a gun to his head. And I thought that was a really interesting description. This man of science, with absolutely no supplies, no camera, nothing, he's going to throw himself into the future. So he shifts his little levers, and then he has this nightmare feeling of falling. And he sees the maid comes in the room, and she's moving in fast motion, and she goes out the door. And then later, of course, when he comes back, she'll reverse that motion. And I thought that was really cool, because in the 1890s, I don't think that there was any kind of a visual example. Cinema wasn't there yet. H.G. Wells is kind of just imagining this like fast-forwarding and rewinding effect. And nowadays, we take that for granted. But I thought that was kind of cool, the way that he describes the initial, flight into the future. Probably my favorite description in this whole book is when the time traveler first activates the time machine and flings himself into futurity, as he says. The night came like the turning out of a lamp, and in another moment came tomorrow. The laboratory grew faint and hazy, then fainter and ever fainter. Tomorrow night came black, then day again, night again, day again, faster and faster still. An eddying murmur filled my ears, and a strange, dumb confusedness descended on my mind. I am afraid I cannot convey the peculiar sensations of time traveling. They are excessively unpleasant. There is a feeling exactly like that one has upon a switchback, of a helpless, headlong motion. I felt the same horrible anticipation, too, of an imminent smash. As I put on pace, night followed day like the flapping of a black wing. The dim suggestion of the laboratory seemed presently to fall away from me, and I saw the sun hopping swiftly across the sky, leaping at every minute, and every minute marking a day. I supposed the laboratory had been destroyed, and I had come into the open air. I had a dim impression of scaffolding, but I was already going too fast to be conscious of any moving things. The slowest snail that ever crawled dashed by too fast for me. The twinkling succession of darkness and light was excessively painful to the eye. Then, in the intermittent darknesses, I saw the moon spinning swiftly through her quarters from new to full, and had a faint glimpse of the circling stars. Presently, as I went on, still gaining velocity, the palpitation of night and day merged into one continuous grayness. The sky took on a wonderful deepness of blue, a splendid luminous color like that of early twilight. The jerking sun became a streak of fire, a brilliant arch in space, the moon a fainter fluctuating band, and I could see nothing of the stars, save now and then a brighter circle flickering in the blue. And I really love that, especially the black wing of night flapping and the sun becoming this streak of fire. It's really, really cool descriptions, and he's feeling kind of sick, and he gets kind of hypnotized as he flies farther and farther into the future. He almost can't even stop the time machine. He's so dazzled by these sensations. And another interesting thing, the time machine itself doesn't move. It moves through time, but it physically doesn't move. It stays in the same place. And so as he's flying into the future, he worries that when he stops wherever he stops, he might sort of materialize inside of solid matter, or he might materialize underwater, or he might cause an explosion of some kind of chemical reaction, because who knows what is on that particular spot 1,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now, 100,000 years from now. And he does end up thousands of years in the future in the year 802,701 AD. He appears in the middle of a hailstorm. He's sitting on green grass. There's thunder and lightning, and he's next to a statue of the Sphinx. And the image of the Sphinx was kind of interesting. I took that as another kind of a duality, because of course the Sphinx has a human head and then the body of a lion, and sometimes it has wings, so like animal and human. And also, I stumbled upon this when I was looking up some information about the 1890s and the time machine and the literature of the time. In 1894, Oscar Wilde actually published a poem, a long poem called The Sphinx. And it was all about this young man who's talking to this Sphinx in the corner of his room. And he says, "Come forth, you exquisite, grotesque, half woman, half animal." And then he asks her if she has witnessed these scenes from history. And he sort of starts talking about the classical scenes and famous historical moments. And I thought, oh, well, maybe that influenced H.G. Wells. The rest of the story, basically, he encounters these small human-like people who are kind of androgynous. He can't speak their language. They speak very simply, and they're kind of like these like little free love beings. So the little people called the Eloi, they all sleep in the same room. They make love in public, shamelessly. They bathe together. They eat the fruit that's just hanging around on the trees. There doesn't seem to be any kind of machinery or appliances. There are no factories. There's no farms. The buildings that they sleep in have the dusty, very dusty curtains, and the tables, the stone tables, are chipped, and it's sort of this beautiful, ruinous decay. That they used to be a very prosperous people, and now they're sort of slipping into this comfortable decay. On the other hand, there are all of these wells, not H.G. wells, but like water wells that go down into the ground, but they may not contain water. What do they contain? Well, they are passageways to this underground network of tunnels, and the time traveler sees these smokestacks sticking up out of the ground, and he can hear this, rumbling machinery and vibrations coming from deep within the earth. The Eloi don't have any kind of system for farming or transportation or anything like that, but underground there seems to be a lot of things going on. However, the beings that live under there, these Morlocks, which are kind of these albino creatures, they are actually running out of food, and so they are preying on the Eloi that live above ground. I understood now what all the beauty of the overworld people covered. Very pleasant was their day, as pleasant as the day of the cattle in the field. Like the cattle, they knew of no enemies, and provided against no needs, and their end was the same. I grieved to think how brief the dream of the human intellect had been. It had committed suicide. It had set itself steadfastly toward comfort and ease, a balanced society with security and permanency as its watchword. It had attained its hopes, to come to this at last. Once, life and property must have reached almost absolute safety. The rich had been assured of this wealth and comfort, the toiler assured of his life and work. No doubt, in that perfect world, there had been no unemployed problem, no social question left unsolved, and a great quiet had followed. It is a law of nature we overlook, that intellectual versatility is the compensation for change, danger, and trouble. An animal perfectly in harmony with its environment is a perfect mechanism. Nature never appeals to intelligence until habit and instinct are useless. There is no intelligence where there is no change and no need of change. Only those animals partake of intelligence that have to meet a huge variety of needs and dangers. To talk about, the great quiet of comfort and how comfort is the death of intelligence. That is a really fascinating theme, I think, and can be explored still now. Long story short, he sort of kind of falls in love with one of the Eloi when he saves this girl named Weena. He saves her from drowning, and they end up spending time together. They sort of kind of become lovers in a platonic way, and they end up going off on an adventure to visit this decaying museum that's very far away, where he discovers all kinds of interesting machines and clues to history and what human evolution became. But of course it's all decaying and almost completely useless. It's interesting when the time traveler returns to the dinner party and he's explaining all of this, he refers to the future as the Golden Age. Even though it's obviously it's a kind of a twisted utopia, or it's a dystopia in disguise, he still refers to it as the Golden Age, and he seems to really like it there. He kind of really romanticizes his time there. Oh, and one other thing that I forgot to say was the whole reason that he spends so much time in the future is his time machine is taken, and it's hidden from him, and he has to go find his time machine before they either take it apart or he's stuck there forever. I really like this book. It wasn't the most amazing thing I've ever read, but it's cool to go back and see in the 1890s what people were thinking about time travel, and to look at the themes of what H.G. Wells thought the future might look like. Not only the time period of the year 802,701 A.D., but also even more distant than that. He goes even farther into the future, and I'm not going to spoil any of that for you. But all right, thank you so much for listening to my rant about The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, and I have a couple recommendations of good time travel stories. Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, one of the absolute greatest satires ever written, and also a great anti-war book, Billy Pilgrim, Traveling Through Time. The Time Traveler's Wife. When you marry a guy who can't stop time traveling and he can't help that he's time traveling. This was a really fun book, and I think they made it into a movie, but I never saw the movie. But yeah, this is a really great one as well. What would you do if you could go back in time? I would go back to meet Genghis Khan. I would hang out with Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. I'd spend some time with Kerouac on the road. I would do so many things, but you know, Stephen King, he would go back and try to stop the assassination of JFK. If you're in for more wacky things, there's always good old Terry Pratchett. Thief of Time. This one, so funny. Was time really stopped? Trapped, only for a moment, but the results still lie all around us. History was shattered, fragmented. Pasts were no longer linked to futures. The history monks had to rebuild it practically from scratch. Susan did not waste breath saying things like, "That's impossible," at a time like this. Only people who believed that they lived in the real world said things like that. "That must have taken some time," she said. Time, of course, was not the issue. They use a form of years based on the human pulse rate. Of those years, it took about 500. Really funny, really interesting. A different way to think about time and where time stretches out and where it shrinks and why. In my review for The Book of Elsewhere by Keanu Reeves and China Miéville, I mentioned The House on the Borderland. This is an absolutely fascinating, weird fiction. This guy doesn't get a lot of love. He's similar to H.P. Lovecraft, but he has his own style. And this book, I believe, was influenced so much by The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. It shares some similarities, but it's much more psychedelic and much more bizarre, and it has many more horror elements. So, highly recommend this one if you've never heard of William Hope Hodgson. Great stuff. In terms of comics, of course, you can't go wrong with Bishop or Cable from X-Men, but also another great time-traveling comic is Paper Girls. The girls from the 1980s get sucked into 1999 and meet their future selves, and it's a really wonderful time-traveling story as well. Alright, that's all I've got. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again some other time.